The clink of silverware carried more judgment than conversation that night, every sound echoing like a reminder that I no longer belonged at the table I had once built with my own hands. My daughter's eyes no longer held warmth. They weighed me down with a coldness that pierced deeper than words. Her husband's smirk lingered, sharp and cruel, as though my presence alone had soured the meal. After decades of sacrifice, of sweat and sleepless nights to ensure their comfort, I sat across from them and felt myself reduced to nothing more than an unwanted burden. The betrayal was not in the sharpness of their tone, but in the quiet precision with which they dismissed me, as though I had reached an expiration date. My chest tightened with the grief of seeing love replaced by disdain, but beneath that sorrow burned something stronger, something they had no idea existed within me. They believed they were stripping me of dignity, but what they were really doing was setting the stage for a reckoning that would one day silence their cruelty. This story is born from sorrow, but carried forward by justice. And as each stage unfolds, you will see how cruelty exposes itself and how the one discarded holds the final truth. Stay with me through this journey. Subscribe so you do not miss a single revelation. Press like if you believe no life should be measured by convenience. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and how this beginning resonates with you. During my first week of retirement, I had carried home a heart full of anticipation, expecting joy, relief, and a sense of belonging when I told my family that my decades of service at the factory had finally come to an end. I walked into the kitchen that evening with a quiet pride in my chest, believing that my daughter Adrienne would be happy for me and that her husband Marshall would offer at least a word of congratulations. I pictured smiles, perhaps a toast with the cheap bottle of wine they kept in the cabinet for special occasions. I had rehearsed this moment in my head during long drives home from work, imagining the warmth of my child's approval, the gratitude of knowing that her father had worked tirelessly so she could grow up secure and educated. Instead, what I received was silence that struck sharper than any words could. The fork Adrienne held slipped from her fingers and clattered against the plate, her eyes wide as though I had spoken blasphemy. Marshall's expression hardened immediately, his jaw tight, his lips curling into a disapproving line that seemed to erase all memory of what I had ever done for him or his wife. I smiled through their stares, forcing the cheer into my voice as I told them it was my last day at work, that after 40 long years I was finally retired. The words I thought would inspire applause only deepened the icy stillness that spread across the table. Adrienne found her voice first, her tone sharp and filled with disbelief. She demanded to know how I could just quit without asking them, how I could so selfishly burden them without considering the impact. Her words stung because they carried not just disapproval, but contempt, as though she no longer saw me as her father, but as an unwelcome tenant who had overstayed his welcome. I began to explain that 40 years of labor had earned me the right to step back, that I had dreamed of this day for as long as I could remember. But Adrienne's voice cut me off. Marshall leaned forward then, his elbows on the table, speaking with a tone that carried authority but no compassion. He called me another mouth to feed. He said I needed to find a job immediately, whether it was flipping burgers or stocking shelves, and that I would not sit around his house living off their money. Each word hit like a hammer to my ribs, and though I tried to keep my smile, inside I felt something fracture. I looked to Adrienne for a softer word, but she nodded approvingly at her husband, her voice even colder as she reminded me I was 65, not 90, and that plenty of people still worked at my age. She even cited her neighbor's father who bagged groceries at 73 as if that comparison justified the humiliation. It was as though none of my sacrifices mattered, as though the college tuition I paid, the wedding I funded, and the countless bills I covered when Adrian struggled had vanished from their memory. I stared at the meal in front of me. The meatloaf Adrian had cooked, a dish that once warmed my heart, but under the bright fluorescent light, it looked gray and unappetizing. My appetite vanished along with my illusions. The conversation continued, with Marshall lecturing me about bills and costs, explaining with exaggerated frustration the burden of maintaining a household, as though I had never known the weight of financial responsibility. He spoke about groceries, utilities, and insurance, ignoring the fact that I had balanced those very expenses for decades while raising Adrian alone after her mother passed. Each accusation of me being a dependent, a freeloader, a burden pressed heavier against my chest, suffocating the warmth I had hoped for. I whispered then, in a voice almost broken, that perhaps I should have discussed it with them first. Adrienne's face softened just slightly, mistaking my words for surrender, and Marshall leaned back with smug satisfaction, declaring that reality was reality and there was no room for a freeloader in their home. That word, freeloader, echoed in my skull long after they both rose from the table. Adrian gathered the plates quickly. Marshall switched on the television in the living room, and within moments, they were chatting casually as though they had not just stripped their father of dignity. I closed my eyes and hoped that the voices would fade, but instead they grew louder, sharper, until I realized they were talking about me. I shifted slightly, careful not to make a sound, and listened as Adrienne's voice rose in annoyance. She could not believe I thought I could just stop working, she said, as if all my years of sacrifice were nothing more than an old man's selfish decision. Marshall responded with a laugh, louder and more cutting, saying that if I refused to work, they would take my pension and put me in a nursing home. His words struck like ice water on my skin, shocking me into full alertness. A nursing home, he said, as if I were already useless, as if my existence could be reduced to a monthly check and a bed among strangers. My knuckles tightened around the bedsheet as I lay motionless in the dark, absorbing each word they spoke with casual cruelty. Adrian added her own barbs, saying I had been mooching ever since her mother passed, reminding Marshall that they had been feeding me for 2 years while I contributed nothing. She ignored the reality that the very house she sat in had been bought with money I provided, that her education had been paid for with my double shifts and sleepless nights, that her wedding had been funded by the savings I had quietly built while going without. To her, all of that had vanished in the face of this new narrative where I was nothing but dead weight. Marshall chuckled again and suggested giving me a deadline, perhaps a week to find work, or else I would be out on the street. Adrian agreed with alarming ease, saying it would be perfect, and if I dared to complain, they could remind me that beggars could not be choosers. Their laughter blended together, cruel and casual, filling the space between our rooms and settling heavy on my chest. I remained still, my breathing slow and deliberate, but inside me something burned hotter with each dismissive word. I remember the checks I had written over the years, $23,000 for Adrienne's tuition, $8,000 for her wedding, countless smaller amounts to keep her afloat when bills piled up. They did not speak of those nights I skipped meals so she could have books, or the times I worked weekends while others rested just so she could dance in a new dress at her prom. All of it had vanished in their eyes, replaced by a story where I was a burden to be rid of. I felt the weight of betrayal pressing down on me, heavier than any years of factory labor. Yet beneath that weight, another feeling began to rise, colder and more steady than grief. It was anger, but not the kind that lashes out in sudden bursts. It was anger forged into steel, patient and calculating, the kind that does not scream but waits for its moment. They thought I was finished, that I was powerless, that their threats of eviction and nursing homes could break me. They believed my modest life reflected weakness, when in truth it was a choice I had made long ago, a choice that had hidden the truth of who I really was. I realized as I lay in the darkness listening to their laughter fade into silence that they had no idea of the man they were mocking. To them, I was a tired old father clinging to pride. But in reality, I was a man who had built something lasting, something powerful, something they would soon discover in the harshest way possible. The house eventually settled in a quiet, but for me there was no peace. My eyes traced the shadows moving across the ceiling as I replayed their words again and again, letting them burn deeper into my memory. Each insult, each threat, each laugh became fuel for the resolve now growing inside me. I thought of Adrienne as a little girl, the way she once ran into my arms when she scraped her knee, the way she once looked at me as though I were her protector and her hero. Now she spoke of deadlines and eviction, of sending me away like an unwanted package. I thought of Marshall, the man I had once welcomed into my family, the man I had trusted to care for my daughter, now laughing about taking my pension and tossing me aside. The betrayal cut deep, but the clarity it gave me was sharper than any wound. I would not let them succeed in making me small. They believed they were in control, but they had underestimated me. They believed I had nothing, that my modest life was the product of struggle and insufficiency, but the truth was very different. I had chosen simplicity, chosen to live without boasting of what I had built, chosen to let them think I was just a man scraping by. They could not have been more wrong. As I sipped the bitter coffee, I thought of the long years at the factory, years of sweat and aching joints, but I also thought of the decisions I had made quietly in the background, decisions that would one day change the course of my family's lives. I remember the day I met Claudia Whitmore, long before she was the CEO of a sprawling empire. She was a woman with a vision, working out of her garage with machines that barely functioned, a notebook full of sketches, and a hunger in her eyes that matched my own belief in hard work. Where others saw risk, I saw opportunity. I handed her a check for $500,000, money I had saved and borrowed, money that represented sacrifice after sacrifice, believing her dream could grow into something real. That check had planted the seed of Whitmore Industries, the very company where Adrienne now strutted into work each day as though she had earned her position through sheer competence, never realizing that her paycheck came in part from the man she mocked as dead weight. My shares in that company had grown quietly over decades, dividends accumulating while I allowed Adrienne to believe I lived hand to mouth. I lived simply, yes, but not because I was weak. I did it because wealth can reveal character, and I wanted to see Adrienne's true nature without the influence of money. Now I had my answer. She had failed that test spectacularly. I thought of the nights when she called me crying from college, panicked over rising tuition costs. I had worked double shifts, eaten canned soup, and taken weekend jobs just to cover her bills. She had no idea that the money did not only come from my wages, but also from the early dividends I had begun to receive from Whitmore Industries. I never told her because I wanted her to value hard work, not believe that her father had some secret reserve to rescue her. When she married Marshall, I covered the difference in the wedding expenses when their budget fell short. They thought their modest ceremony had cost less than $10,000, but in reality it had nearly doubled, and I had covered it quietly, watching them dance in bliss while I stood in the corner with pride. They never knew the truth of how much I had sacrificed and how much I had given. And yet here they were, threatening to take my pension, threatening to send me away, calling me useless. I let the bitterness settle in my chest, but I also let it sharpen my mind. I returned to my bedroom and opened the drawer of my nightstand where I kept an old folder, worn at the edges from being opened so many times over the years. Inside were letters, contracts, and dividend statements from Whitmore Industries, proof of my role in building the company that now employed 3,000 people across Oregon and Washington. I ran my fingers over the paper, remembering the handshake in that garage, the faith I had placed in Claudia when nobody else believed in her. She had delivered on every promise, and in return I had kept my distance, content to let the company flourish while I stayed in the shadows. Adrienne believed she was successful because of her own talent, but the truth was her career existed only because I had given Claudia the means to build the company in the first place. I tucked the folder back into the drawer, smiling faintly to myself. They thought they had power over me, but power is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. My plan began to take clearer shape. I would not shout the truth at them in anger. I would let them believe they had won, let them believe I was beaten, while I slowly positioned myself to turn their cruelty back on them. Adrienne wanted me to take a job. Marshall wanted me to prove my worth. And they had no idea that the very company where they hoped to humiliate me as a janitor was the company I had helped build. I finished my coffee and sat at the table with the morning newspaper, the same routine as always, but my mind was not on the headlines. I moved slowly, lowering myself into the chair at the table with the slight groan of an aging man, and I let my face carry the weight of quiet defeat. Adrienne glanced up at me, her expression cool, and asked if I had thought about what we discussed the night before. Marshall smirked, clearly eager to press his advantage, and told me I would need to start looking for work immediately. I nodded, forcing a small smile, and said they were right. A man my age should contribute, and I saw that now. The surprise in Adrienne's eyes was unmistakable. She had expected resistance, perhaps another lecture about my years of work, but instead I gave her surrender. Marshall leaned forward, savoring the moment, and offered a suggestion he had clearly been waiting to deliver. He said there was an opening at Whitmore Industries for a janitor, that he could speak to his boss and get me the position. He spoke with satisfaction, as if the idea of his father-in-law cleaning floors in the company hallways was a fitting punishment. I forced my expression to brighten with gratitude, nodding quickly and saying it sounded perfect. Inside my chest, however, I felt a surge of dark amusement. The irony of being offered a janitor's position at the very company I had helped build was almost too much to bear. But I kept my voice steady, my face calm, playing the part of a humbled man. Adrienne reached across the table and patted my hand in a condescending gesture, telling me it was good I was finally facing reality. I thanked her, letting my voice tremble just slightly, as if the weight of her approval mattered to me. Marshall puffed his chest with newfound authority, outlining the duties of a job as though he were already my supervisor. He told me I would need to report at 7 in the morning sharp, follow orders without complaint, and accept that the pay would be minimum wage because beggars could not be choosers. That phrase, the same one I had heard through the thin walls when they mocked me the night before, echoed again in the air between us. I swallowed hard and nodded, letting them see only obedience. Adrienne smiled faintly. Marshall smirked with satisfaction, and both of them believed they had finally broken me. They had no idea that their triumph was nothing more than the first step of my plan. As the day went on, Adrienne called Marshall's office to arrange the details. I listened quietly from my room as he explained to someone on the other end of the line that he had solved a family problem by finding work for his father-in-law. His tone carried pride, the kind of pride that comes not from true accomplishment, but from humiliating someone else. I sat at my desk, pretending to read the newspaper, but every word he spoke only deepened my resolve. They thought this was their victory, but it was only their invitation for me to walk back into the company I had helped create back into the walls that held my legacy, where the truth would inevitably reveal itself. That evening they acted lighter, more cheerful, as though the tension had been resolved. Adrian cooked dinner, and Marshall poured himself a drink, and they talked about groceries and bills as if I were not even there. I ate in silence, nodding when spoken to, shrinking into the role of the compliant old man. But inside, my mind moved swiftly. Every detail mattered now. Every step had to be deliberate. They thought the next Monday would be the start of my servitude, but in reality, it would be the beginning of their downfall. Later that night, when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling once more, I reflected on how far I had come. The sting of their betrayal still burned, but it no longer paralyzed me. Instead, it propelled me forward. I had spent a lifetime building quietly, sacrificing without complaint, watching over Adrian with the love of a father who wanted nothing more than her happiness. I had carried her through childhood, through college, through marriage, never asking for more than respect. When Monday morning came, I moved deliberately, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, my work clothes folded neatly on the chair, and the cleaning supplies Marshall had purchased still in the bag by the door. I let the minutes pass while Adrian and Marshall bustled about preparing for their day, their voices drifting in and out of the room. Adrian reminded me that I needed to be at Whitmore Industries by 8 o'clock sharp, while Marshall smirked and said he would be checking with his boss to ensure I had reported for duty. I smiled faintly and told them I understood. When they left for work, I remained at the table, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper as though it were any other day. The clock ticked past 8, and I imagined the scene unfolding at Whitmore Industries. Claudia Whitmore arriving for her rounds, Marshall preening with self-importance as he explained that he had solved a staffing problem by hiring his father-in-law as a janitor, and then the confusion when no such janitor appeared. By 8:15, the phone rang, and I answered with deliberate slowness, knowing exactly who would be on the other end. Adrienne's voice cracked with panic as she demanded to know where I was. She said her boss was furious that Leonard, her name for Claudia's husband, unaware that Claudia herself was the true leader, had been expecting me and that my absence had humiliated her in front of management. I let my voice tremble slightly as I told her I must have gotten the time wrong, that my mind was not what it used to be. I apologized profusely, pretending confusion and forgetfulness, while inside me there was only calm satisfaction. Each word of her frustration, each rise in her tone, was proof that my first move had landed exactly as I intended. She raged about how she had vouched for me, how she had told her boss I would be reliable, and now she looked like a fool. I apologized again, my tone meek, and told her I would do better tomorrow. When she hung up, I sat back and allowed myself a quiet laugh, the kind of laugh that comes not from joy, but from the satisfaction of outmaneuvering an opponent. Adrienne had strutted into Whitmore Industries with her head high, convinced she had humbled her father, and within hours she had been reduced to embarrassment and suspicion. She would have to face her colleagues with the knowledge that her credibility had been damaged, and all because of the old man she thought powerless. Later that day, she came home with a storm on her face, her words clipped and angry as she berated me for failing my first day. I bowed my head, apologized again, and told her age must have gotten the better of me. She threatened that there could be no mistakes tomorrow, that she would drive me herself to ensure I arrived on time. I nodded in silence, playing the role of the chastened father, while my mind was already crafting the next steps. Marshall joined her in the tirade, speaking as though he were a manager scolding an incompetent employee. He told me I had embarrassed Adrienne, humiliated their family, and that if I pulled another stunt like that, there would be consequences. I nodded, my eyes cast down, letting them believe they held the upper hand. But in truth, I had achieved exactly what I wanted, Adrian was rattled. Marshall was agitated, and both of them were beginning to feel the cracks in the power they thought they wielded. That evening, as they sat in the living room watching television, I sat alone in my room with the old folder of documents spread across my desk. The dividend statements, the letters from Claudia, the contracts signed decades ago, all of it reminded me that I was not the defeated man they believed I was. Years of working with budgets had trained my eyes to spot irregularities, and the figures on those reports screamed manipulation. I waited until he stepped into another room to take a phone call, and I quietly photographed the documents with my phone. Later that evening, I studied them again, comparing columns of numbers that told a story he surely believed was invisible. Office supplies inflated by hundreds. Maintenance costs doubled. Invoices for services that looked suspiciously vague. At first, I wondered if I had misunderstood, but the more I studied the numbers, the clearer the truth became. Marshall was stealing from his firm. I knew then that patience would serve me better than confrontation. I reached out to an old acquaintance, Michael Richardson, a forensic accountant who owed me favors from my professional days. I asked him quietly to obtain authentic records from Henderson and Associates, where Marshall worked, and to compare them to the inflated figures I had captured. Within days, Michael returned with proof. Marshall had been embezzling funds by altering expense reports, siphoning away money in small but steady amounts, clever enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but sloppy enough that someone like me could see through it. I filed the evidence away in a folder, waiting for the day it might be useful. That day had now arrived. After Adrienne's humiliation at Whitmore Industries, I knew the balance of power in this household needed another push, and Marshall's secret was the lever I intended to use. That afternoon, while Adrienne was still at work and Marshall was distracted with his endless phone calls, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I logged into an anonymous email account I had created weeks earlier, attaching copies of the falsified reports alongside the authentic documents Michael had secured. I drafted a letter to Mr. Henderson, Marshall's employer, laying out the discrepancies with the calm precision of a man presenting undeniable facts. I wrote that his employee, Marshall Green, had systematically embezzled funds through falsified invoices and inflated expenses. I included dates, amounts, and vendor names, leaving no room for doubt. Before I hit send, I leaned back in my chair and considered what this would mean. Marshall, who smirked when he told me I would clean floors for minimum wage, who laughed with Adrienne about sending me to a nursing home, would soon face the collapse of his career and reputation. Adrienne, who relied on her husband's income and stability, would watch as her smug confidence eroded beneath the weight of scandal. Their world, so carefully balanced on the belief that they held authority over me, would begin to crumble. I clicked send. The message vanished into cyberspace, carrying with it the seeds of destruction. I closed the laptop, fed the physical copies of the documents through my paper shredder, and sat back with a quiet satisfaction. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon sun painted the world in golden light, but in my chest there was only cold calculation. Hours passed before the first sign of impact arrived. At 6:40 in the evening, the front door slammed open, and Marshall stumbled into the house, his face pale, his tie loosened, his eyes wild. Adrienne rushed to him, asking what was wrong, and he blurted out that his boss had confronted him with evidence of embezzlement. He said the firm had suspended him pending investigation, that auditors were being brought in, and that his career was likely finished. Adrienne gasped, tears filling her eyes, while Marshall ranted about betrayal, about someone sending documents directly to his employer. He insisted he had been careful, that nobody could have noticed. I remained seated in my chair, my expression composed, feigning surprise as Adrienne turned to me with pleading eyes. I asked what had happened, my tone filled with concern, and Marshall snapped that it was none of my business. Adrian sobbed into his shoulder while he paced the room, his hands trembling, muttering about how their lives were about to fall apart. I watched them quietly, hiding the satisfaction burning within me. The same man who had mocked me as a burden, who had told me I was dead weight, now stood in his own living room exposed as a thief, stripped of dignity. Adrian, who had believed she controlled my fate, now clung to her husband in desperation, unaware that the downfall she feared was a direct result of the father she had scorned. I excused myself gently, saying I would give them space, and retreated to my bedroom. Once inside, I closed the door and allowed myself to smile. Phase 2 was complete. Adrian had been embarrassed at her company. Marshall had been suspended and branded a criminal. Adrian begged him to tell her it was not true, that he had not been stealing, but each time she pressed, his answers grew weaker, his voice cracking as he swore that the accusations were false even though his eyes betrayed guilt. I sat quietly in my armchair, the same chair where I had been branded a freeloader days earlier, and pretended to listen with the detached sympathy of an old man who could offer little comfort. In reality, every word confirmed that the trap had sprung, and Marshall was too tangled in his own lies to escape. Adrienne's cries rose higher, accusing him of putting their lives at risk, asking how they would survive if he lost his job, asking how she could face her colleagues knowing her husband was under investigation. Marshall snapped back that it was not his fault, that he had been pushed into it by circumstances that everyone exaggerated, but his voice carried the hollow desperation of a man whose excuses had finally failed him. The power dynamic that had defined this household began to shift before my eyes. Just days ago, Adrian and Marshall sat across the dinner table dictating terms to me, smirking as they spoke of deadlines and nursing homes. Now they were turning on each other, their unity crumbling under the weight of Marshall's disgrace. Adrian clutched a tissue and sobbed that everything was falling apart, while Marshall cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the wall, railing about betrayal from inside his company. He could not comprehend how the evidence had been so detailed, so precise, as if someone had been documenting him for months. I lowered my gaze, hiding the quiet satisfaction in my eyes, and murmured that sometimes the truth finds its way out in unexpected ways. Adrian looked at me as though I might offer wisdom, but she quickly turned back to her husband, her desperation too great to see the irony. As the night wore on, Marshall slumped into a chair, exhausted, his bravado gone. He admitted the firm had suspended him indefinitely, that auditors were combing through every expense report he had submitted in the past year, that they had already found irregularities that could not be explained away. Adrian gasped as if struck, realizing what this meant. The salary they depended on would vanish, their stability shattered, their reputation in tatters. I sat still, listening to every word, watching as the cracks widened, watching as the man who had mocked me as dead weight faced the truth that he had been the true liability all along. Adrian pleaded with him, asking if there was any way to resolve it quietly, but Marshall shook his head, his face buried in his hands. He muttered that once auditors became involved, there was no going back, that criminal charges could follow, that they could lose everything. Her sobs grew harsher, and she clutched at his arm as if holding on to him could stop the avalanche. But nothing could change the course now. I rose from my chair and stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Adrienne's shoulder, speaking in a soft tone that carried sympathy but no promise. I told her that families endure hard times, that sometimes truth cannot be hidden forever, that what mattered was how they faced what came next. She looked up at me with tear-streaked cheeks, nodding as if my words were comfort, though in truth they were only reminders that consequences come to all, even those who laugh at their elders in the dark of night. Marshall raised his head, his eyes bloodshot, and glared at me as though he suspected something. He muttered that this whole mess had started the same week I had embarrassed Adrian at Whitmore Industries, that my sudden confusion and absence had made them both look weak, and now this scandal had arrived like a curse. I met his gaze calmly and said perhaps the world has a way of revealing truths at the most inconvenient times. His glare faltered, replaced by the haunted look of a man who knows deep down that his downfall is of his own making. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Adrienne's quiet sobs and the sound of Marshall's uneven breathing. The house, once filled with their laughter at my expense, now rang with their despair. I returned to my chair, folded my hands, and watched as they unraveled, neither of them realizing that their undoing had been orchestrated by the very man they had dismissed as powerless. Later that night, after Adrienne had cried herself to sleep and Marshall sat alone in the dark with a glass of whiskey, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling once again. I sat quietly at my place, eating toast and sipping my coffee with the air of a man trying not to intrude, though inside I observed every detail with calm precision. Adrienne finally broke the silence, her voice strained and brittle, accusing Marshall of destroying everything. He snapped back that she was ungrateful, that he had only tried to provide, and that circumstances had forced him to bend rules at work. Their voices rose, bouncing off the kitchen walls, and I sat still, listening, remembering the night not long ago when those same voices joined in laughter while they plotted to put me in a nursing home. Now the cruelty that had once been directed at me was turned inward, each of them tearing at the other. Adrienne turned to me suddenly, her eyes wild, demanding to know why I was just sitting there doing nothing. I bowed my head and said softly that I did not know what help I could offer. She scoffed bitterly and said I could at least stop being another mouth to feed, that with Marshall's income in jeopardy, the last thing they needed was an old man freeloading in their home. Her words stung, but not in the way she intended, because I had already prepared myself for such attacks. I let my voice tremble and told her she was right, that perhaps I should have done more, that I would try harder. Adrienne crossed her arms, glaring at me as if my submission offered her strength. She declared that she would drive me to Whitmore Industries herself the next morning, that there would be no excuses, no mistakes, and no confusion about the time. Marshall muttered agreement, though his tone lacked the force it once carried. The proud man who had mocked me was now hollow, his voice brittle, his authority drained away by the scandal that consumed him. Adrienne, however, grew sharper, more desperate, clinging to control as though her fury could shield her from the truth of their crumbling world. That evening, as they argued again in the living room, I listened from my bedroom, letting their voices wash over me like waves against rock. Adrienne accused Marshall of selfishness, of risking everything, of making her a laughingstock among her peers. Marshall accused her of coldness, of demanding perfection without understanding pressure, of blaming him while she reaped the benefits of his dishonesty. Their words tore at each other until Adrienne finally fell silent, her sobs muffled against a pillow. Marshall poured himself another drink, muttering curses under his breath. I closed my eyes and let the sound of their unraveling fuel the resolve within me. They had once believed they held my life in their hands, but now they struggled to hold their own lives together. The next morning, Adrienne woke me before dawn, her tone clipped and businesslike, instructing me to be dressed and ready within minutes. I obeyed without complaint, pulling on the janitor's uniform they had prepared for me, letting the costume transform me into the role they wanted to see. Marshall lingered in the doorway, his face gray with fatigue, his eyes avoiding mine, his shoulders slumped under the weight of shame. Adrienne grabbed her keys and gestured sharply for me to follow. On the drive to Whitmore Industries, she lectured me in harsh tones, telling me there could be no more failures, no more confusion, that if I embarrassed her again, she would have no choice but to throw me out. Her hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened, her voice cracking with desperation, and I realized that beneath her fury lay terror. The life she had built on the foundation of her husband's salary and her own shallow pride was collapsing, and she needed someone to blame, someone to control. In her eyes, I was the convenient target. I let her words wash over me, responding only with quiet acknowledgments, nodding as though I accepted every accusation. But inside I knew the truth. Adrian was unraveling, her authority born of illusion now crumbling as quickly as Marshall's career. They were desperate to keep me beneath them, desperate to believe they still held power, when in reality they were already standing on ground that had been hollowed out beneath their feet. As she parked the car in front of the gleaming glass building, Adrian turned to me with eyes blazing and repeated her threats. She said if I made her look foolish again, if I dared to falter, she would drive me straight to a nursing home and sign over every penny of my pension to cover the cost. I looked at her, let my eyes soften with what she thought was resignation, and whispered that today would be different. My words made her pause, confusion flickering across her face, but she shook it off quickly and ordered me out of the car. We walked toward the entrance together, she striding ahead with the confidence of someone who still believed she held the reins, and me shuffling behind in the clothes of a janitor. Every step carried me closer to the moment when the truth would tear through the lies they had woven. Adrian believed she was in control. Marshall believed he was fighting to salvage his pride, but I knew that both of them were already trapped in a web spun long before they realized they were prey. That night, when we returned home, Adrian repeated her threats again, her voice breaking with frustration, telling me this was my final chance, that she would not tolerate humiliation. She pulled into the parking lot, found a space near the front, and yanked the key from the ignition with such force it rattled. I stepped out slowly, playing the role of the reluctant old man, letting the morning breeze stir my thinning hair, while Adrian strode toward the glass doors with her back straight and her chin raised, believing she was about to put her father in his place once and for all. We entered the gleaming lobby together, she leading with quick steps and me trailing behind, mop and bucket in hand, the perfect picture of humiliation. The marble floors shone beneath the overhead lights. The sound of voices and footsteps echoed off the walls, and the rush of employees hurrying to their offices filled the space with energy. Adrian nodded stiffly at the receptionist and instructed me to stand to the side until she could present me to the right person. I obeyed silently, lowering my eyes as though ashamed, though in truth my heart beat with steady calm because I knew Claudia would appear at any moment. And then, right on cue, she did. Claudia Whitmore came down the corridor with the graceful confidence of a woman who had built her empire from nothing but determination and vision. Her silver hair gleamed beneath the lights. Her tailored suit gave her the aura of power, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room as she made her rounds. Adrian spotted her and straightened at once, her voice rising with eager authority as she called out, "Ms. Whitmore, perfect timing. I'd like to introduce you to someone." Claudia looked up from the tablet in her hands and paused as she recognized Adrian, offering the polite smile she reserved for middle managers who craved her approval. Her gaze shifted to me, the old man in a janitor's uniform standing meekly by the bucket, and for the briefest moment she did not react, but then recognition flared in her eyes. Adrian, oblivious, placed her hand on my shoulder and said with misplaced pride, "This is my father, He'll be joining us as a janitor to help with some of the maintenance needs." The words hung in the air, smug and self-satisfied, as if she had accomplished something noble by turning her father into a cleaner. Claudia froze. Her face shifted from polite distraction to cold fury, her eyes narrowing as she fixed them on Adrian with such intensity that the air seemed to grow colder. She stepped forward, her heels striking the marble with sharp precision, and asked in a low, dangerous voice, "You brought him here like this? In a janitor's uniform?" Adrian blinked, confused, and stammered, "Yes, ma'am. I thought it would be best. He needed to work, and this was an opportunity." Claudia cut her off, her voice rising now, echoing down the corridor so that employees stopped to listen. "Do you have any idea what you just done? Do you know who this man is?" Adrian faltered, her face paling, while I slowly straightened to my full height, letting the submissive posture fall away as if I were shedding a skin. Claudia turned to the gathering employees and declared, "This is Wallace Mercer, one of the largest shareholders of this company, the man without whom Whitmore Industries would not exist." Gasps spread through the corridor. Adrienne's mouth fell open, her eyes wide, her body frozen in disbelief. The mop slipped from my hands and clattered to the floor, not from weakness, but as a deliberate act, the sound punctuating the truth like a gavel. Claudia's voice grew sharper, her words slicing through the stunned silence. 25 years ago, your father invested $500,000 in my dream when no one else believed. He is not a janitor. He is my partner. And you paraded him through my halls in a uniform meant to humiliate him. Adrian staggered back a step, her face drained of all color, while whispers spread among the onlookers. Claudia turned back to her with fire in her eyes and said, "You're finished here. Pack your things and leave the building immediately." Adrian gasped, shaking her head, pleading that there had been a mistake, that she had not known, but Claudia did not waver. Security appeared at her side, waiting for the order, and Claudia nodded firmly. Adrienne's shoulders collapsed, her authority gone, her face twisted with shock and shame as she realized her career was over. The very company she boasted about, the one she thought gave her power, had just revealed that her father had built it and that her arrogance had destroyed her standing. I looked at her then, my voice calm but firm, and said, "I told you today would be different." Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to speak, but no words came. The silence in the lobby was thick with judgment, and every employee who had once seen her as a manager now saw her as the daughter who had humiliated her own father out of greed and cruelty. Claudia placed her hand gently on my arm, her fury softening as she looked at me with respect. "Wallace, let's speak in my office," she said, her voice warm now, filled with the affection of an old friend. I nodded, leaving Adrienne standing in the wreckage of her arrogance, her body shaking as security escorted her away. Claudia led me through the hushed corridors of Whitmore Industries, the sound of her heels steady against the marble while whispers trailed behind us. Employees who had moments before walked past me without a glance now studied me with awe, piecing together the revelation that the quiet old man in a janitor's uniform was in truth one of the pillars upon which their company stood. Adrienne had been escorted away, her protests ignored, her face streaked with tears as security guided her toward the exit. For years she had believed she was the one carrying the weight of responsibility, the one dictating terms to her father, but now she was stripped bare, exposed as ungrateful and blind to the man who had given her everything. Claudia's office was, as I remembered, spacious and lined with the history of our shared victories. The mahogany desk gleamed beneath the soft light, photographs of milestones we had achieved together framed neatly along the walls, each image a testament to the journey from garage startup to corporate empire. She gestured for me to sit in the familiar leather chair across from hers. And as I sank into it, I felt the strange comfort of returning to a place that had always been mine, yet had remained hidden from Adrienne's knowledge. Claudia studied me with eyes that mixed respect with sadness. Wallace, why let her think you were struggling when you've had all this? Why allow her to treat you that way? I breathed slowly before answering, letting my words carry the weight of truth, because I wanted to see who she would become without the shadow of money. I want to know if she would respect her father for the man he was, not for the fortune he had built. I thought perhaps she would remember the sacrifices, the nights I worked while she slept, the years I gave so she could live freely. Instead, I learned the truth. Claudia nodded, her expression grave, and the truth broke her. I shook my head. No, the truth revealed her. She chose arrogance, she chose cruelty, and she chose to see me as a burden when all I had ever been was her father. Claudia leaned back, her sigh heavy, and for a moment the silence in the office pressed against us. Adrienne sat in the lobby beyond, waiting to be escorted out of the building she had once believed proved her worth. Marshall sat at home, suspended, his career in ruins because of the theft I had revealed. And I sat here, not in victory, but in a strange melancholy that comes when the lesson you deliver is harsher than you ever wanted it to be. Yet I knew it had to be done. Claudia eventually rose and placed her hand gently on my shoulder. Whatever happens next, Wallace, know that you still have this company, and you still have me. You are not alone. I nodded, grateful, though my heart carried a heaviness that could not be lifted by wealth or power. I thought of Adrienne as a little girl, running into my arms with scraped knees, laughing as I pushed her on swings, crying in relief when I told her not to worry about tuition. That child was gone, replaced by the woman who had threatened me with eviction, who had laughed with her husband about nursing homes and pensions, who had dressed me in a janitor's uniform without hesitation. I could not undo that transformation, but I could make sure she understood the cost of her choices. When I left Claudia's office and stepped back into the corridor, employees stood a little straighter, offering me nods of respect. Adrienne was nowhere to be seen. Her termination had been swift, and her career was over. Outside, the sky was gray with the promise of rain, and I walked slowly to the car waiting for me, feeling the cool air on my face. My heart was calm. At home that evening, Adrienne and Marshall sat in silence, both broken in different ways. Adrienne's eyes were red, her voice gone, while Marshall looked hollow, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of disgrace. They did not speak to me, and I did not speak to them. Some truths are too sharp for words, and the silence itself was punishment enough. Later, alone in my room, I stared at the old photographs again. The graduation, the wedding, the holidays, and I felt both grief and clarity. Family is not defined by the money you give or the sacrifices you make. It is revealed in how those gifts are remembered. Adrienne had forgotten, Marshall had never cared, and both had mistaken kindness for weakness. I had allowed them to believe I was powerless, and in doing so, I had uncovered who they truly were. My legacy was not the company or the wealth, but the lesson etched in the collapse of their pride, that respect cannot be forced by power, and gratitude cannot be purchased with money. It must be chosen freely, and if it is not, then the absence of it destroys more thoroughly than poverty ever could. As I lay down and closed my eyes, I felt no joy in their ruin, only the quiet knowledge that the balance of justice had been restored. They had tried to make me small, and in the end they saw how vast the truth really was. The next day would come with its own burdens, its own decisions about what to do with Adrienne and Marshall. But for now, I allowed myself to rest, not as a freeloader, not as dead weight, but as Wallace Mercer, a man who had given everything and demanded only respect in return. The end. Before you leave this story, I want to speak to you directly. You have followed me through every chapter of betrayal, revelation, and justice, and now I want to know how it felt from your side. Did the way Adrian turned on me hit you as hard as it hit me? Did Marshall's arrogance and downfall feel earned? Or do you think he deserved something even harsher? And what about Claudia standing by me after all those years? Did that give you the same sense of quiet relief that it gave me? I built this story on what it feels like when respect is stripped away and then painfully reclaimed, and I wonder how much of that connects to your own experiences. Tell me what part of the plot struck you the most, and where in the world you're watching from. Your perspective matters to me. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe because there are more stories waiting that dig into the same kind of hidden truths and raw emotions. And if you like the journey, hit that like button so I know it was worth telling. More than anything, share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear how you saw the twists, how you felt about the ending, and what it says about family, dignity, and justice.